This is the Emotion Connection, where you'll experience health through feeling. Explore emotion from a different perspective and learn how to use your emotions to improve your day-to-day life. Introducing your host, founder of the Emotion Research Institute and creator of Emotional Strength, Sharon Fay. Sharon heads up a successful business empowering leaders to bring about organisational development and cultural change. Get your senses ready as we delve into the many facets of emotion together. Over to Sharon.
Hello, I'm Sharon Fay. Emotion is my thing. Today's podcast is on emotional strength and looking at emotional strength possibly being the missing link in life. And it's a subject that's dear to my heart because I developed emotional strength through having a really tough life. And as I was navigating through this very difficult childhood, I realised that I was building emotional strength, and I didn't know it at the time, but I know it in retrospect. The structure of today's podcast is, firstly, what is emotional strength? And I think it's important to put it into context. So I'll be defining emotional strength and putting it into context of a story as well. And the reasons that emotional strength is important, and how do you live with emotional strength? And is emotional strength the missing link? Because more research has to be done on that. And the research that the Institute will do will be collaborating with neuroscience or biomedical sciences. So that's to come in the future. But upon reflection, I believe that emotional strength saved my life. Just let me explain. It's public knowledge now that I suffered severe abuse as a child, and children who experience severe abuse often end up very numb. And for me, as a numb child, the world just didn't make sense to me. My education didn't help because that was fragmented, moving from state to state in Australia and from school to school, missing basic education. And these humble beginnings left me without the resources, and by resources I mean, confidence, self-esteem, self-awareness. I didn't have any of those basic resources that regular children have. And I didn't have these resources, so it made it more difficult to navigate through my life. My world back in those days was chaotic and unpredictable. And of course, the feeling of my world was unsafe and there was danger everywhere. I was in danger at home with an extremely critical and abusive mother. I was in danger at school, judged as retarded, and of course need to excuse the language of retarded. That's not language that we use these days, but that was the language that was used back then. People looked at me differently. I could feel their judgment. And teachers spoke to me very slowly. And I'll always look at behaviour and what is the underlying assumption that these teachers had of students in that class. And I would suggest that their underlying assumptions of the class I was in was that we were all dumb. So by the time I was 10 years old, I had what they used to call back then a nervous breakdown. I don't know what people saw to label it that way, but I imagine they saw a pretty shut down little child with quite withdrawn. And my mother was always moving from place to place, so she moved back to Western Australia at that time when I was 10 years old. And living in the slums of Perth was very challenging, and I was just used to, trying to sleep with screaming throughout the night on the streets, climbing over derelict people to get through the front door. Alcohol was everywhere. There was blood and screaming and swearing. And that's what I experienced every single day of my life. The primary school was rough and I couldn't really learn anything. It was a very unsafe place. And what made it worse, even in those days, every student in Year 7 had to sit an intelligence test. And it was no surprise, it wouldn't be any surprise to my listeners here, that I did very poorly and was allocated to the lowest class in high school. I hung in there for 1 year, and the second year high I couldn't stand it anymore, so I ran away, and I ran away from home and school. And I became a street kid and ended up a teenage alcoholic, because that's what we did on the street back then. It was tobacco and alcohol. I could really say that this was probably my lowest point up until that time in my life. So one day when I was laying in the gutter, the sun shining in my eyes, I looked up and I saw a man in a black suit carrying a black briefcase. And as that silhouette walked past me, I saw in that moment a contrast between the man in the suit as successful and me lying in the gutter as a failure. And that ended up being one of the turning points in my life. And as I eventually got to my feet and staggered off to a public toilet to clean myself up, as I did every day, I always remembered the man in the black suit. And in retrospect, I believe that this was the beginning of emotional strength as we know it today, and that was 55 years ago. You can hear through that story that I was a victim of childhood abuse, and I fell through the cracks of an overloaded education system. I suppose I could have stayed as a victim. I had every excuse to continue living life like that. It's a difficult story to relive. But something in me said, this can't be it. Just didn't make sense. There had to be more to life than this. And I feel very emotional remembering that. I'm still like that today. This can't be it. There must be more to life than this, surely. And there was. Must have been my intuition. But emotional strength, now, having saved my life, has evolved to being a way of life for myself and many others. It makes sense. And in my own development of emotional strength, it's become a philosophy, a lens to see myself through the world, a lens to see myself in the world. And one of my life ambitions is to collaborate with different sciences, like neuroscience and biomedical sciences, to conduct experiments. It's fascinating to understand how connecting to your emotion provides a healing capacity within your body. And that's incredible. In the meantime, I'd like to discover and help you discover the application of emotional strength in everyday life. And the structure that I'm going to talk about now is really based on the definition of emotional strength. And I'll just read that out. It's from our paper, Fay and Hooper in 2018, published paper. And for me, it's the ability to respond in an open and vulnerable way in the face of intense emotional experience. Now, when we're open and vulnerable, we can respond to anything. And then we've got the opportunity to feel deeper into the emotion, which allows access to the implicit functional processes driving action. That means to me, it gives me access to the resources that I didn't ever know I had as a child. So when I break the definition down, there are just 3 components, because it's quite an academic paper, so I just want to make it understandable. And from a practical perspective, open, the word open in the definition, means open within yourself. It's not necessarily open to everyone else. So for example, when I feel confusion, I'm aware of the feeling in my body, but I'm not necessarily sharing that feeling with anyone else. Because sometimes, and I've discovered this as you probably have too, sometimes sharing private feelings may put you in danger. It might be a colleague judging you as confused and uses confusion as code for not capable. And the word vulnerable is an important one in emotional strength, because typically we don't have vulnerability, we don't feel it, we don't show it. And it's a bit like other animals, they don't show their vulnerability because sometimes it means that a predator can attack them. There's lots of examples of animals that protect themselves from predators. And I believe that human beings are like that as well. We protect ourselves. So vulnerability in this context refers to the capacity to experience hurt. And as I've shared before, the hurt is that aching in my chest. But it's not actually the act of being harmed, so there's no danger there. It's the capacity to experience hurt, which is very different. For example, if you attend one of my public speeches or keynotes, you'll see me being vulnerable. And if you're not used to this, seeing someone like that, it may be confronting. For example, I had some feedback from 2 different people in one of the presentations I gave recently. One person shared that he was shocked to see me looking so nervous when he's used to seeing me so confident. So this was that person's judgment of me as nervous, when if he had asked me what I was feeling, I would say I felt vulnerable. Another person in the same audience recognised my vulnerability and labelled it as that, which is amazing, and shared that he used my vulnerability to reflect on his life while I was speaking, which gave him space to engage with himself, and he felt very grateful. So you've got 2 different interpretations of the same person feeling vulnerable. So that's how interpretation can happen, and people are going to judge you or make that interpretation based on their underlying assumptions and their own judgment. And it's interesting how I can present to groups, to various audiences, in a vulnerable state. I find that fascinating. Even though my vulnerability is judged, I actually like the feeling of vulnerability inside me. And I also understand that it's difficult for people to look at, especially if they're not used to it or they don't know actually what it is. And in my paper, I came across, when I was doing the research, I came across this author called McCoy in 2013, and she describes vulnerability, and it's very close to how I think about vulnerability. So I'll just read the quote from her book. She puts it this way: "Not only individuals, but also political communities must come to terms and respond appropriately to the vulnerability that exists within. Indeed, vulnerability strengthens interpersonal bonds within a community and is closely intertwined with a number of different facets of ethical life. I thus suggest that rather than treating vulnerability as something to be avoided, vulnerability is a necessary component of living a rich and authentic human life in community." And that's how I think of vulnerability as well. Like, it does strengthen the interpersonal bonds. For me, when I'm sharing these things with you, the listeners, it's a very deep connection that I feel when I'm feeling that vulnerability. So vulnerability was the second component of how I've defined emotional strength. And the third one is emotional responsiveness, which is different to reacting to triggers in your life. Emotional responsiveness is being visibly engaged, activated, or moved by one's experience. People mask and pretend everything's okay when it's not, and you probably know what I mean. I've probably done that myself. Some people know when they're masking and some don't. In these cases, it's not easy to tell when someone is being real. But what helps is when you're in your body, when someone is not authentic and you're in your body, you can feel it. You can pick up that something about their energy doesn't make sense. You might be able to look at a person and see that they have emotional responsiveness, that people look alert, switched on. Their posture's different from the masses, and they're flexible in their response moment by moment. And you may have been emotionally responsive as well when you're switched on, when you're feeling like you're in the zone, in the flow. And that's an important part of emotional strength, because some of you who are advanced in practicing emotional strength, you know that feeling when you're on, and that's when you're in your body, when you're responding in the moment. It's a wonderful feeling. And the reasons that emotional strength is important is because we seem to, when we're connected to our emotion, we seem to heal. We don't even know that that's happening. We don't even know how to heal. The bodily systems are just doing it. Even though I've experienced this for over 25 years, the Institute will look at this scientifically, and we'll create hypotheses around that research. With funding, we'll be able to collaborate with neuroscientists and biomedical scientists to design studies to test a series of hypotheses relating to this connecting to your emotion and how your physical symptoms tend to reduce. It's amazing. And how do we live with emotional strength? Well, to me, emotional strength is a way of life. When you have emotional strength, you can see yourself. As I often say, it starts with a change in attitude towards emotion. You develop awareness about emotion and you begin to understand the purpose emotion plays in your life. And it's not about changing. It's not about changing yourself. You're just in a process of learning about the self and parts of self that you like, parts of self you don't like. The way you grew up. You might judge those experiences as good or bad, but that's part of the process. And at this stage, you don't need to stop the judgment. You just need to be aware of the judgment in the moment. And this is the beginning of the practice of building a capacity for emotional strength. To see yourself just the way you are. And I've always wondered how emotional strength is the missing link. I feel deeply that it is, but we need the science to confirm that. And it's about exploring how emotional strength could be the missing link in living a healthy life. For example, we're all used to suppressing or avoiding negative emotion. As I said, when I was a child, I was pretty suppressed and I was numb. And the only reason that I would have suppressed negative emotion, and that we all do it, is if we have an underlying assumption that emotion is bad or wrong. So the underlying assumption that I would have had as a child is that if I express myself, or if I cry, or if I cower, then I would be more punished. You might not even remember how or when you started to suppress uncomfortable feelings. You just find now that it's an automatic response, as I did back then. And maybe you've never thought about this before. I didn't know at the time that I was numb. That was just the way it was, and I was just in survival mode. And what if you practice feeling and it becomes your automatic response? So instead of suppressing or suppression being your automatic response, what if it's feeling is your automatic response? To feel all emotion. I wonder what that would be like. What if you started to practice connecting to negative emotion and becoming aware of what it feels like in your body? And then what if your health started to improve for no apparent reason? What if your relationships started to improve? What if you started speaking up to people that you have difficult relationships in your life, including your loved ones? What if life started to improve and you started to see yourself and the world more clearly? I am curious to find out if changing your attitude towards negative emotion might make a difference. What if connecting to all emotion is the key to feeling fully alive? And I wonder if the missing link is about changing your automatic response from suppression to connection. That's an interesting thought. From suppression to connection. So just to recap, we talked about what is emotional strength, the three components of emotional strength, the reasons that emotional strength is important, how do we live with emotional strength, and how is emotional strength the missing link. So for homework this week, I would like you to be aware of your judgments. Judgments can be made about yourself or other people. A bit of a tip, you might hear yourself saying something critical about you or gossiping about someone else. At first it's hard to hear your own judgments because that's just become normal, and you just need to get your ear in, so to speak. You can hear one little judgment. It might be, it's a minimal response. Or you roll your eyes, or you go, really? In your mind. There's lots and lots of ways you can start to identify your own judgments. Sarcasm is very unhelpful. People use sarcasm as a form of humour, but always in sarcasm someone will get hurt. You won't know it at the time, but they'll walk away and they'll have to deal with their hurt in private. So raising your awareness about your own judgments is a vital part of starting to become alive, starting to wake up. And I'd love to hear how you go, and you can let me know through the website, emailing me, leave a comment. You can engage in lots of different ways with us and with me. And so the next podcast is a Q&A, as I promised, a Q&A session. We've had lots of comments, lots of questions about all 3 episodes. So I've put that into a Q&A session, and it'd be interesting if that raises more questions. When people share their insights, that means we're all learning as well. So it's a very generous thing to do. And the next podcast will be on the emotion-body connection. And we're so used to hearing about the mind-body connection, but what about the emotion-body connection? So that'll be an interesting discussion. So listen in and find out more, and I'll see you next time.
Well, that's a wrap. The Emotion Connection is produced by Sharon Fay and her team at the Emotion Research Institute. With a vision to help people feel, this is just one way we're spreading the word. From our hub in Perth, Western Australia, our goal is to advance global research on human emotion and bring together the world's best scholars to conduct rigorous research into emotion all in one place. Would you like to help? Do you have feedback or suggestions? We'd love to hear from you. Visit emotionresearch.com.au to get in touch, sign up to our newsletter and learn more. If you'd like to support our work, make a donation. Remember, your generosity fuels our vision, and contributions over $2 Australian are tax deductible. See you next time.